When I talk about generational equilibrium, each generation was supposed to at least impart the values of the previous generation so that there'll be no generation gaps in going forward.
And the artificial state is fundamentally designed to put us in classes to create a particular class.
And the parents need to receive the education in knowing how do I skillfully bring up and manage this purpose that has been assigned to my custody.
We as kingdom citizens need to develop entrepreneurial activity and kingdom businesses that help people thrive in who they're wired to be.
Hello and welcome to Unlock the Kingdom Within You. This podcast explores the profound truth about what it means to be born into the kingdom, not a religion. On this podcast, we challenge the religious and denominational norms which shackle us from expressing the liberty of Christ by exploring the kingdom, the Ekklesia, and citizenship. If you're born into the kingdom but lost in religion, then this channel is just for you. So thank you for listening and don't forget to subscribe.
So guys, thank you so much for joining the third session, which we're on now, which is basically going to be focused upon education, and the emphasis of that session is shaping the minds of the future citizenry. And I think this is a really important session because it's going to require us, as we sort of assemble today, and to think about the society that Jesus wants us to build and be involved in. You know, part of ensuring that we pass down the correct history, heritage, and inheritance of the kingdom to future generations is going to be when we nail this most important element, which is specifically around education. So getting into the session, shaping the minds of the future citizenry. So I have in the session with me, I've got Anderson Williams, I've got Kelvin, and I've got Ivan for us to begin to have this conversation. So the first thing I'm going to flag here is something that I think is dear to my own heart, and that is the importance of understanding God's purpose in education, which really is about examining somewhat the interplay between nature and nurture. So, Anderson, I'm going to put you on the hot seat. Understanding God's purpose in education. What do you think?
Now, there are several answers to that question in terms of what is his purpose for education. At the core of education is not just a matter of providing an individual with basic information sufficient to pass an exam. I think that's what education has become today. And most educators spend more time giving a student information that they have to almost kind of memorize in order to kind of regurgitate. And so education today is almost like mental abuse because your mind was never designed to memorize, it was designed to generate ideas. Yeah. And the moment education is reduced to just memorizing, to regurgitate, then education has already become something that is almost a cake. Secondly, the objective of education is primarily designed to create a very strong moral underpinning. Education is incomplete without moral underpinning. So what we have today, you may have an educated person who is a thief. He's a politician, but he's crooked and corrupt. There was a time when I think, was it Moody? D.L. Moody said that if at all you have a guy who is saved but has no morals, he kind of would just be an arbitrary kind of individual. But then you educate an immoral person and they could steal an entire train track. So what passes for education today is basically providing someone with information without no moral underpinning. The third objective is to create what I call generational equilibrium. When I talk about generational equilibrium, each generation was supposed to at least impart the values of the previous generation so that there'll be no generation gaps in going forward. And so generational equilibrium is this sense of balance and this continuous flow from one generation to another, where a generation is not left to more or less kind of discover its own values for itself. And the fourth thing, I'm just kind of throwing this back and forth, the fourth objective behind education is so that there is this sense of serious and very clear sense of your own identity. There is no education without individual identity and individual purpose being discovered within the broad spectrum of God's objective. So if you cannot identify yourself, locate yourself, be aware of who you are instead of the broad objective, then education is compromised. And in that regard, we come to the danger of colonialism and the impact of imperialism upon our current educational model, because imperialism was never designed to truly educate someone. It was designed to create a factory worker or a house slave. That model has never really helped us.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I think helps to frame that is, we've talked about this before, is the idea of the fact that many of us were raised in the artificial state. And the artificial state is fundamentally designed to put us in classes to create a particular class. And that requires very little creativity and innovation.
Right.
And we thought technologically, we thought in the last few years, or I should say in the boom of the information age, we thought that that would sufficiently rattle the cages of the elites and those in established government, but it really didn't, because ultimately what ended up happening is they always use it as a way of saying, well, something new is on the horizon. It fundamentally might change the landscape of things, but actually we've got to find a way of bringing it into what is the existing ecosystem, and perpetuating the same thing. I think fundamentally, going back to that point about God's purpose in education, we must, at the heart of it, recognize the creative origin of it. In other words, in its very root simplicity, for example, when a child is learning to walk, it's not sitting there with a manual. In other words, at the very heart of this, part of what makes education exciting is the fact that we are creatively learning at the same time. And unfortunately, within some aspects of the structures within the educational systems that are artificial, it removes the creative process and limits the ability person's capability to be innovative, and obviously drives them towards a form of certification that is linked to trying to get them from one level of class into another. And that's something that we're definitely going to have to look at the heart of, because one of the challenges is obviously when you enter into the kingdom of God, there is only one class, that's the God's class. And so within that framework, there should be an educational development that is unique, understands the uniqueness of that person within the context of this commonwealth that they have a responsibility as a citizen to take forward. And that's where I think I talk about, the history, heritage, and inheritance being so important. It's become least important within the societies that we are part of. And as a result, it's created the working class. It's created those that are primarily driven to move the state forward, to move the mechanisms of the state forward, rather than to change the state and make the state more perfect. Ivan, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, let me provide a little context in terms of education. So my wife just retired from the Chicago public school system in the United States, Chicago being one of the biggest cities in the US, after being there for 35 years in the same school and having 8 different principals as the leaders for that school system. I was involved in helping her get her master's in education. I also was a school administrator, a Christian school administrator for 4 years, and then the overall principal, and launched a high school with 120 students from all over the city of Chicago as part of my career track. So a little context, a little history. In terms of what you've mentioned, Fred, there's been a lot of movement. I'm in the state of Indiana, and there's a whole homeschool movement right now because there's so many people dissatisfied with public school education. Because they're being introduced, their kids are being introduced to topics and issues that parents feel they have no right to be exposed to, and they're taking their kids out of the public school system. So as Christ followers, as kingdom citizens, what are we to do about that? I know that there are a number of initiatives across the globe that are trying to address this issue. There are people that are having gatherings on Zoom across different countries and across different nations who are saying, how do we develop a kingdom-centric educational system that, to Andy's point, grounds kids morally, and then from that place, we help them identify what their gift sets are, how they're wired, and what is their purpose. And then, almost like the Montessori method, how do you put kids in an environment where they can explore and investigate and try to understand what it is that they're called to and what they can do with their gift sets?
Well, and just to comment, I thought it was really interesting when you brought in some of your experience, because I knew, running a Christian school for about, 4 to 5 years with a curriculum that was unique, that sat outside of the existing state school system. I firsthand experienced the challenge of a number of levels. So the first one was the challenge of convincing Christian parents that this was a worthwhile endeavor with their children. Now, it makes absolute sense. Your children are your prized possession, and the most important thing, and you have a responsibility to raise them. But fundamentally at the time, to convince Christian parents to recognize that their children needed a unique way of being raised that would both give them the relevant skills and tools in society, whilst at the same time underpin that with that strong moral framework, especially a biblical framework, it was very difficult. And I think that's also in part because in our country, for example, in the UK, private schooling and even homeschooling is not something that's part of the culture. Predominantly, people have their children and straight away they give them to the state. Now, they don't see it that way, but in reality, they give them to the state. And within giving them to the state, they have options. Some of those options are generally driven by how local the schools are to where they are. So I think most of the control for parents actually sits usually at the nursery and preschool level, because often at that level you have to pay for the education. But after that, because the costs are so high, after that they're handed over into the state simply because it's more cost effective. Now, one of the arguments I've always had is we've got in our country, there's a drive against, and generally a push from politicians against faith schools. There's a sort of a looking down upon faith schools in a sense. But one of the things I've always said is, well, I pay my taxes like any other person within this particular state. Why should I not be allowed to see that my taxes, which I pay for, are driven towards the education that I want for my children? And that's what I think it's the basis of it. It comes down to the argument there. It's not to say that we need a hodgepodge of an educational system that tries to, like as Anson was saying, provides information, but isn't necessarily driven towards the peculiar needs of our children. It just tries to sort of tick every box, but fail in the process. Why can't we support the development of schools that are unique, or I should say not schools, let me say educational systems that are unique, okay, that actually then allow our children to flourish in the way that as parents we want them to. Now, I think key thing I want to bring out, and I want to bring Kelvin into this, is this important idea of parents owning the responsibility of raising up a child in the way they should go. I think that's fundamental, because one of the challenges I faced is that I realized when we started our school, I realized very quickly whether or not our children who were from our community were being raised in the faith or not. What I found was they were often being shuttled into church, shuttled into children's ministry, youth ministry, and parents were heavily relying on youth ministry and children's ministry to actually do the raising. And so the actual ownership, and I bring this down to the men, particularly in families, fathers and husbands and fathers, that responsibility to say, no, the education of my child in the kingdom is my responsibility. I'm responsible for that. I'm the teacher. I need to take my child through that process. I think, what do you think, Kelvin, would be the significant impact of taking ownership of education in that way first in our families, that would then maybe spread out into our communities and maybe bring about some of that change we're talking about?
Designed by Citizens for Citizens, the Nation Builders App is designed for you to get involved with building the society Jesus had in mind. The app is built upon 4 principles: connect, communicate, community, and collaborate. Connect through your very own digital profile. Share your thoughts and ideas through engaging posts, videos, and events. Communicate. Develop long-lasting friendships with fellow citizens through your own personal inbox. Receive real-time alerts on new comments, messages, likes, and friend requests. Community. Our open door policy means you can connect with online communities and special interest groups to fellowship together, collaborate. Our civic spaces focus on cultivating the civic life of citizens through community, education, governance, and enterprise. Don't delay. Sign up for free now at www.nationbuilders.community or download our free Nation Builders app on Play Store.
There definitely has to be a credible investment because children will not thrive on neglect. There has to be an investment. There has to be the correct type of investment. One of the things that I see inside of this, and it just comes to my mind, when Jesus said, "Let the children come to me," right? Not, people think that it's just to hug them, right? He's bringing an emphasis that if we start with the children, we can start with better society. We can start with a better society, with the proper education for our children, and to really make the investment inside of them. So it does begin at home. Fred, I do believe that. And I think that it begins with not knowing. How about starting there? Starting there with not knowing, not assuming that we know. Because when you look inside of the child, what you really find is really the purpose of God. So you have to know who you're raising. So the parents need to be educated, and the parents need to receive the education in knowing, how do I skillfully bring up and manage this purpose that has been assigned to my custody?
I think it's so important that we recognize that part of the way we were parented often rolls down and cascades down into the way that we often look after our children. And unless we intensely disrupt that process, deliberately disrupt that process, then what ends up happening is it just becomes the usual thing that we do. And I think that's where the challenge is. We talk about intercepting the younger generation, but the reality is have we sufficiently adopted a position that says, I'm going to own the responsibility for my education and for this life in front of me that I've got to raise? And I'm going to say, no, raise up a child in the way that they should go. That's my responsibility. It's mine. And with that responsibility, I'm going to actually make the necessary sacrifices, put in the necessary things in place. And that will include, more than anything else, myself taking the child along a journey, transitioning with them into adulthood. I find it also interesting how little within the context of the church world, the understanding of the maturation process of a child. There's very little understood about that. In terms of how do you really raise a child up in the way that they should go? That process is really not understood. And I think there's a key word I'm going to drop in over to Anderson to jump on this, is this idea of what has happened with the culture of outsourcing everything, including the responsibility of raising our children. What's been the detriment of that on our own kingdom society and the societies around us?
It has several detriments. One is that the average parent absolves themselves of personal responsibility. And the second thing is that the average parent assumes that effective training of a child involves a certain level of academic proficiency. So some parents are of the opinion that this child is better suited to be in this school under that particular teacher, that advisor, etc. Now, there is the old traditional practice of philosophers having apprentice. But when you think about a parent's role in education, observe the Bible does not say that the parent has to teach a child. Neither does it say that they have to instruct. It talks about training. Training is a different dynamic altogether.
Yeah.
And so I don't need to know all of the rudiments of philosophy. I don't need to know all the laws of mathematics, because that is not my responsibility. It's almost like a co-pair kind of dynamic between parent and church, or parent and ecclesia, or parent and school. But training really involves the very concept of what a train is today. The train is not that long thing that you see in a track. The train really is the one at the front. It's the locomotive at the front. That is the train. And so the concept of training is me as a parent taking my role at the front of the whole exercise by modeling, by patterning, by holding to certain values. I don't have to be the most brilliant academically to train my child, because I have to provide the most adequate and appropriate environment that will allow that child's creative thinking skills to balloon and blossom. I think, again, we go back to what passes for education. In more ways than one, our current educational model does not speak to that critical thinking capability, because we shut down the Socratic component, which is asking questions. And so if I talk about training and not outsourcing, and I want to create a child who has a mind that is explosive, that's popping, and that is constantly expanding, then part of my responsibility is to create an environment where my child could engage me. I should not be this dictatorial, manipulative parent. I should allow that child to ask me questions, because the biblical model for training and educating from an Old Testament perspective is, as you walk in the field, talk to them about this. As you do this, the question is, how many parents will walk in the field with their child? Or has life become so inundated with trying to make money that we have ignored the fundamental responsibility of just being practical? Not in a very informal. Most of us as parents, the only time our children know about God is in a formal setting. And so you have to have, like, we have to have family altar. And that's the only time your child hears about God in a formal setting. But you read Deuteronomy, I think it's Deuteronomy 6 or so, it is in a very impractical, informal, very down-to-earth kind of thing. And that's where my role as a father and as a parent comes in. And whatever addition comes in from the philosopher, from the teacher, from the church, that's like a supplement to what I bring in. But what you have is the average parent today taking themselves out of the role, thinking, well, okay, it's the pastor's responsibility to teach you spiritually, and it's your teacher's responsibility to teach you academically, and they pull themselves out.
And then what happens, and I'm just going to hand to you on that, what happens is we no longer become custodians of the faith, because we've outsourced it to other people. And then we blame those people when we don't get the outcome that we desired.
Absolutely. And not only do we blame them, but then we create a reactionary response. And so Ivan mentioned what's happening in the US right now. And I still don't think that the reaction of most of these parents is the right one, because they are responding to what they call woke ideology and what they are describing as critical race theory. It's a response. And all they're going to do is to recreate the same madness, because they still are not understanding their fundamental role. They are reacting to woke, and they are reacting to politics.
Yeah, Ivan.
I really wish Charles was on this. I think the reason that this has become such a critical issue is because of the nature of the economic need that families have. In my experience, I have two parents, both working two jobs to support their economy, and they're sending their kids, they're relegating their kids to a system in order for them to not have to worry about where their kids are, worry about what they're eating, worry about their, not have to have that as a major worry. I'm going to put my kids in school so I don't have to worry about them, because I got to go make money to support my lifestyle, and I got to go make money to support the needs and the expenses that I have in my home. I think the Ekklesia's role as it relates to kingdom and how do we help families become more kingdom citizens is about helping people understand how they're wired, what their purpose is in the kingdom of God, help them to thrive in an environment where curiosity drives their thirst for understanding of who they are and what it is they're wired for and designed for in this world. A lot of people, as Andy has responded, are basically have been colonized when it comes to their function in the world. They are basically being trained on how to support the larger corporations and companies that are out there and how to continue that legacy, not their legacy, but the company's legacy and the owners of the company's legacy in the world. We as kingdom citizens need to develop entrepreneurial activity and kingdom businesses that help people thrive as who they're wired to be. And so the purpose of education is to help people do that. We've talked about children and young people. I think there's educational opportunities for adults Fred, you've got the example. You're doing apprenticeship organizing and fleshing out and providing opportunities for people in the UK. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing in that environment?
Yeah, I mean, in that environment, I'm part of an organization that's been around since 2017, which is developing standards and models for apprenticeship. Within the UK, over the last 40 years, we've moved away from having a manufacturing base to a primary financial services base. And so what's happened is that strong sense of innovation and development has been lost. So as a result, like discussed earlier, it's been about more driven towards the economy and how much you're earning to survive and get by, rather than developing something creative that then you champion in a world, bringing it to market, and then taking it forward and creating opportunities from that. My son's, before I hand over to Kelvin to come in, my son's 17 right now, and I've taken him on a journey over a number of years to help him understand the kingdom and to help him to come into manhood within that. But interestingly enough, I've said to him, there's a phase in your life, I've taught him the phases in his life, and I said, there's a phase in your life you're in right now where it's about win, lose, or draw. I want you to go and grapple with the economy of society, and I want you to work, bring your innovation and work on it, and see the creative process work out from there. And so he's not necessarily, there are some people, the young people, that already know they want to go into a particular job, they want to go into a particular career. All right. And of course, in that regard, they would take a particular schooling system to do that. And that makes sense if that's what you want to do. But the reality is our current artificial structure of society cannot accommodate every design or idea or creativity within the heart of a person. It just can't. And so that's why you see the sort of the big winners in society being the entrepreneurs, because they've got an idea that they want to bring to market. And it's not gonna work out through the existing educational system. It has to work outside of it because of the level of its creativity, and the system just has to, and its regulation has to follow suit.
Thank you for joining our fireside talk about the kingdom. My name is Frederick Tobin, and I hope this podcast has been a blessing to you. If you'd like to continue to receive fresh insight into the kingdom, click the notification bell to follow us. For further information about the kingdom, visit our website www.unlockthekingdomwithinyou.com to download your free ebook. See you soon.